Alfredo Paul was one of those people to whom unfortunately life had said no to all his questions, denying him all possibilities. He had been born into a dysfunctional family, where both father and mother were thieves and drug dealers. With drug-dealing uncles and other relatives in jail, his family name seemed to carry a curse of sorts. From his childhood, the only thing Alfredo Paul remembered fondly were the few hours he had been able to dedicate to reading several volumes of encyclopedias that were in his house, without knowing where they had come from and that his parents used them when they needed paper to wrap something or to start a game. But before they completely tore them apart, the boy had been enraptured by all the knowledge that was illustrated there and secretly dreamed of becoming a biologist someday. The rest of his childhood had been a constant headache. His parents paid no attention to him, except when they wanted to use him in some of their businesses, because as a child nobody watched him, and if they caught him he wouldn't go to jail. Alfredo Paul was for them an instrument for their illegal transactions more than a son, and they never worried about him learning anything else besides reading, writing, and making stories. And this only because he would be needed at some point in his work, because they expected him to be exactly the same as them. Also, if you have not done so already, please subscribe to our channel and click that notification bell to get inspired by these real-life stories every day. Now, back to the story. As time went on, Alfredo Paul became more and more involved in his family's shady business dealings, but he wanted none of it. When he turned 11, he tried to run away but was soon found. From then on, they made an effort to include him even more, so that when he felt a desire to run away again, he would have no escape but two options: jail or death. However, even though Alfredo Paul knew that he would end up dead, he never stopped trying to get out of that world. But nothing worked out well for him. By the time he'd knocked down one obstacle to his goal, 5 more had already appeared in his path. They lived in a whole cycle of wanting to escape and not being able to until he began to think that perhaps his only escape was death. And he tried to end his life several times, but even this couldn't work out. In his 17th year, when he met Jessica, hope came back to him. Jessica was exactly like him. She came from a family of criminals, but she had never really wanted to be in that world and had also tried everything to escape. For the both of them, meeting one another in person in their same situation was like finding an oasis in the middle of the desert, and they became inseparable. A couple of months later, they became sweethearts and began to fight to get ahead together, get married, and have their own home with children to whom they would never impose such as unhealthy an environment as the one they'd been forced to live in. But they were both in a dangerous transition to adulthood, and they knew that the slightest mistake would land them in jail, since they already had a record and no one would condescend to them now. And when it finally seemed that they had everything ready to escape, to leave the country without a trace and start a new life somewhere else, Alfredo Paul was captured for possession of weapons and drugs and was imprisoned for almost 3 years. When he got out, nothing was the same. He had no news of Jessica and hoped that she'd been able to escape, although deep down he felt that she was already dead. And it was then that his family put the definitive shackles on his existence. Alfredo Paul went from being a simple drug dealer and occasional jumper to become a murderer, albeit by accident. One afternoon, he had the bad idea to clean his gun when there were other people in the room, and without planning it, the gun fired a fatal shot into one of his uncles. From then on, the rest of his family used the psychological argument that he now had blood on his hands, and there was no turning back. If he wanted to keep his life, he had to do what they wanted. And it was then that he learned that Jessica was still alive, that she managed to flee the country, but they didn't know her location and that love her was a mistake, and they would go after her. In reality, Alfredo Paul never knew if it was real or had been simply used as a lie to influence him to fear because he never heard from her again. But faced with a faint hope that she was alive and safe, Alfredo Paul didn't want to take a reckless risk and resigned himself to what would be her final fate. The years passed, and besides the fact that he'd been denied the possibility of studying and becoming a biologist as he dreamed in his childhood, the field of love was also denied of him. First it had been Jessica, then Jan, and then Andrea, and each of them had disappeared from his life. The first one we already know, the second one died from an overdose, and the third murdered in front of his eyes in a settling of scores. At that moment, he decided that he would never get close to anyone, he wouldn't have a partner or friends, and so he wouldn't risk anyone. And with that, he was signing forever his sentence of loneliness, a loneliness that accompanied him for almost all his life and was the only one that saw him grow old. By the time Alfredo Paul turned 50, all his immediate family members were already dead, and in reality, although not without complications, perhaps it would have been a good time to finally be able to flee. But there was also someone else who would also have died, and that was Alfredo Paul's spirit. He was simply so exhausted and demoralized that he didn't have the same strength to face his destiny again, as he'd lost everything in the attempts. So finally, Alfredo Paul was getting older, and by the time he was 65 years old, he stopped stealing, as his agility was no longer the same. But instead, he began to become increasingly sought after for transporting and selling drugs on the streets, as his appearance was an innocent older man when unnoticed by authorities. So Alfredo Paul became the dealer par excellence for hundreds of addicts who trusted only his merchandise. And when he turned 75, those who hired him had the idea of giving him an even more innocent appearance and decided to give him an ice cream cart. Among the rest was camouflaged. So Alfredo spent most of the day in the park and sold ice cream as naturally as possible. During all that time, people looked at him with pity and found it very sad to see someone his age selling ice cream to make ends meet. He was always alone, and more than once they paid for the ice cream at a higher price to help him out. Also, there in broad daylight with so many people nearby, the old man delivered his other merchandise, although the main sales were at night. Then, after finishing his day in the park when the sun was setting, Alfredo Paul would go to a bus stop that wasn't very crowded and would finish selling everything else within an hour. However, one day, like any other, the authorities noticed the old man at a bus stop with his ice cream cart. They had noticed that none of the passing routes had been taken and people were approaching him but not to buy ice cream, so they didn't understand what the old man was doing there and approached to ask. When they arrived, Alfredo Paul offered them ice cream calmly and even opened the cart to show them the flavors available. As bad luck would have it, he had left the background covering his other merchandise wrong, and the policemen realized that it wasn't ice cream they could see there. But in reality, they didn't imagine what the old man was hiding something so shady. So when they took a good look and realized what was there, they were completely astonished. In Alfredo Paul's face, they saw the confession that in reality he never wanted anything like that for his life, but he had no other choice. However, their obligation was to arrest him. Thus, Alfredo Paul spent the last 5 years of his life in prison, where he passed away. His last thoughts were of the wonderful encyclopedias he'd read in his childhood. No one should live a life without opportunities, or a life in which good intentions are so crushed that then only evil and bitterness remain, bitterness for life. No old man should end his life like Alfredo Paul. The only thing he knew was to commit crime, and that was the only thing he did until the last day of his life, without wanting to, because loneliness and the need to survive had brought him there. Perhaps in another world, surrounded by better people and with better opportunities, Alfredo Paul would not have been the strange old man who sold drugs from an ice cream cart, but the prestigious academic he wanted to be in his childhood. If you like this story, like it, share it with your friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel.